The tureen was too heavy for one person. She had known this from the moment the head footman placed it in her arms at the kitchen passage door. The silver burning cold through her white gloves, the weight settling against her ribs like a rebuke. She had carried it the length of the corridor nonetheless, stepping with the precise economy of someone who had learned that small disasters announce themselves with sound, and that silence was its own kind of competence. She was a woman who had been practicing that economy for some time, and she had become very good at it. The dining room of Asterfield House was lit by 40 candles and the appetites of 16 guests. She entered from the left-hand door behind the guests' chairs, as she had been instructed. She did not look at the table's head. She had been instructed not to look there either. The smell reached her before she had completed 3 steps. It was faint, the way something wrong often is, faint and particular, buried beneath the warm richness of turtle and cream, and the good cognac that had seasoned the stock. She had grown up on her father's estate in Hertfordshire, where the kitchen garden produced everything from culinary herbs to the medicinal simples her mother had kept in a locked cabinet, and there was a smell beneath the soup's surface that her body knew before her mind had shaped the word for it. Bitter. Particular. Not a cooking smell at all. Not any smell that belonged in food meant for a man's table. She stopped. One of the other maids brushed her elbow in passing, and the tureen shifted. And then everything happened the way things happen in a nightmare. The silver tilting, the lid sliding, the great rolling wave of pale soup parting company with its vessel, and spreading in a generous and irreversible flood across the white tablecloth, across the nearest bowl, across the second bowl, across the third, across the lace cuff of the man seated at the table's head, and finally, mercifully, coming to rest in a steaming catastrophe that silenced 16 guests at once. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Nora Beale stood with an empty tureen in her arms and looked at the Duke of Asterfield's cuff. She did not look at his face. She could not yet bring herself to look at his face. What she did not know in that moment was that the Duke of Asterfield was not looking at her at all. He was looking at his cousin, Bernard Correll, seated 6 chairs down, and noting the precise quality of the expression that had crossed Bernard's face at the moment the soup spilled, not the social horror of the other guests, not the wince of the inconvenienced, but something earlier and sharper, something that looked, from the corner of a careful man's eye, very much like a man watching an opportunity dissolve. If someone is still listening, and I think you are, hold that image. It will matter before the story is done. The first to speak was Mrs. Patton, the housekeeper, who had materialized from the far door with the speed of a woman conditioned by 30 years of household catastrophes. "You stupid, clumsy creature," she said, not loudly, directing the words at the girl in a hiss through the nearest footman's ear. "Get out. Get out now." The girl got out. She carried the tureen back down the corridor and into the kitchen and set it on the long scrubbed table without a word. And then she stood with her hands very still at her sides and waited for the thing she knew was coming. She had been a maid in this household for 6 weeks. She had carried tureens without incident for 6 weeks. She supposed that record would not carry the evening. She had been Miss Nora Beale of Langford, Hertfordshire, until 2 years ago. Her father, Thomas Beale, had been a gentleman of modest means and immodest learning, a man who quoted the poets at breakfast and kept bees and believed with the particular confidence of the comfortable that his family was insulated from catastrophe by the simple fact of his being who he was. The entail had taken the estate within 6 months of his death, passing it to a cousin whose name Nora could not speak without something hardening behind her sternum. Her mother had died 2 winters before her father. There was a sister, younger, placed now with an aunt in Bath, who accepted the arrangement on terms that did not include Nora. There were, in the end, no terms that included Nora. She had found her own terms, a character reference written by her father's former solicitor and a position in the household of the Duke of Asterfield, secured through an agency that asked few questions. She had not mentioned Langford. She had not mentioned the bees or the kitchen garden or the locked cabinet of simples. She had mentioned only that she was reliable and quiet and could carry a tureen without incident. That last claim had now been put to the test. The wound beneath her surface was not the entail itself, though the entail had been catastrophic enough. It was the verdict the entail had delivered, the message spelled out plainly in a dozen small withdrawals. She had become, overnight, invisible to the people who had known her. Former neighbors who had dined at her father's table twice a month crossed the street to avoid a conversation. Girls she had grown up alongside did not write. A man who had been paying court to her for the better part of a year sent a note through his solicitor terminating the connection, and the note did not trouble itself with anything as careful as an apology. The world had decided, in the absence of her father's income, that she was not someone whose notice it required, and she had been living inside that verdict ever since, trying to locate some piece of herself that the verdict had not yet reached. She was thinking of this, standing in the kitchen, when the housekeeper's assistant arrived with word that Lady Wharton wished to see her. She smoothed her apron and followed. Lady Wharton arrived in the kitchen 20 minutes after the spill, still dressed for dinner, her fan tucked under one arm like a weapon at rest. Lady Wharton was the Duke of Asterfield's maternal aunt, a woman whose social authority rested on 20 years of being the most correct person in any room she entered. She was not cruel in the cartoonish sense. She was confident, which in the machinery of the season amounted to the same thing. "You will collect your belongings," she said to Nora, "and you will be gone by morning. I will not provide a character reference for a girl who cannot manage a soup tureen. The agency will be notified." "Yes, my lady," Nora said. She went upstairs to the small room she shared with 2 other maids, and sat on the edge of her cot in the dark, and pressed her hands flat against her thighs until they stopped trembling. In her apron pocket, she could feel the small rectangular weight of the thing she had carried with her from Langford since the morning she left it for the last time. A copy of Cowper's poems, her father's, the boards worn soft at the corners from a lifetime of handling, She had carried it every day of her service as a kind of proof that she had once been someone who read poetry for pleasure, rather than performing the motions of a life she did not recognize as her own. A knock came at the door. Not Mrs. Patton's knock. A different knock altogether. The man who entered was Mr. Fenn, the Duke of Asterfield's steward, a thin, quiet man of middle age who managed the estate accounts with the air of someone for whom surprise had been surgically removed. He held a folded note, which he did not read aloud. "His Grace," Mr. Fenn said, "requests that you remain." "Lady Wharton dismissed me," Nora said. "His Grace requests that you remain," Mr. Fenn said again, and placed the note on the table beside her cot, and left. The note said nothing. It was a blank sheet of paper folded once, as if the instruction had been issued without the explanation, and the explanation had been determined unnecessary. Nora remained. She was given, in the morning, a new assignment. The library. She was to catalogue and organize the Duke of Asterfield's collection, which had not been attended to since the previous librarian's departure, and was in a state of considerable disorder. She was not given a maid's uniform. She was given a plain, dark dress from the upper household stores and told to present herself at the library door at 8 o'clock. She presented herself. The library was empty. She began to work. It was large. The library. 2 full walls of floor-to-ceiling shelves, a long table in the center, a fireplace at the far end that was kept banked against the spring chill, and 3 windows that faced the rear garden and admitted, on clear days, a particular quality of morning light that Nora recognized as the same light that had come through the windows at Langford and which she had given up expecting to see again. She did not stand at the windows for long. She went to the shelves and began. The collection had last been properly catalogued, according to the ledger she found lying on the table, in the autumn of 1807. 4 years of neglect had produced a situation not unlike grief, she thought. Things placed in proximity by accident or inattention, grouped by the logic of proximity rather than the logic of belonging. She worked methodically, the way her father had taught her to work, beginning with a count rather than a judgment, establishing what was present before deciding where it ought to go. He had applied this principle to everything, to the kitchen garden, to the bees, to the correspondence he undertook on behalf of parishioners who could not write. First, know what you have. Then decide what it means. She found on the second morning a shelf of botanical texts that had been misfiled among histories, and spent the better part of an hour with them before she remembered where she was and returned them to their appropriate location. She had always found it difficult not to read what she was meant, only to move. It was a quality she had learned to suppress, in the household, as a quality likely to be misread. The plain, dark dress she had been given instead of the maid's uniform helped, in a small way, with that suppression. It reminded her that she occupied an in-between position here, neither maid nor guest, and that the in-between was where she must learn to be comfortable. The Duke of Asterfield came to the library on the 3rd morning. He did not announce himself. He entered from the far door near the fireplace and crossed the room to one of the reading chairs and sat down with a document that had nothing to do with books and was silent for an hour. Nora continued working. "You read Latin," he said, without looking up. It was not a question. He had observed from the document the ordering she had imposed on a shelf of classical texts. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. He said nothing else. He left 20 minutes later. In the following days he returned with the same regularity, sitting in the same chair, bringing different documents, and the library existed in a kind of occupied silence that Nora could not decide was companionable or simply indifferent. He was not what she had expected. She was not certain what she had expected of a man who had watched the destruction of his dinner party in silence, and then kept the responsible maid on without explanation. But she had not expected this. The absolute stillness of him, the way he occupied a room without claiming it, the attention he paid to things other people did not think worth attending to. She noticed him noticing. She did not think he noticed that she noticed. She was wrong about that, as she was wrong about several other things. She discovered Mrs. Cartwright on her 4th day in the library. The old housekeeper had come to sit in the window seat at the library's north corner with the permission of someone, presumably the Duke, and she did this each afternoon for an hour, sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes turned toward the garden with the expression of someone who was looking at something no longer visible. Mrs. Cartwright was half blind, Nora learned from the kitchen, and the letters she received from her niece in Wiltshire went unread for weeks at a time, the text too fine for the old woman's eyes to track. On the 5th day, Nora sat beside her and read the most recent letter aloud. Mrs. Cartwright did not thank her. She only said, when Nora had finished, "She keeps hens now," with the satisfaction of someone for whom this was precisely the information she had most wanted. On the 6th day, Nora brought the next letter. On the 7th. On the 8th. She did not know he had come in on that 8th afternoon. The fireplace was lit, and the afternoon had settled into a particular warm quiet, and she had read 2 letters without looking up. And it was only when she reached the end of the second that she became aware of the stillness in the room had changed quality. She turned her head. The Duke of Asterfield stood just inside the far door, not sitting, not moving toward the shelves, not carrying a document. He was watching her. He had been watching her for some time. When her gaze reached his, he did not look away. She felt the pulse at her throat register his attention before she had formed any coherent response to it. A warmth that had no permission, rising in her face, in the specific skin along her collarbone, entirely involuntary and entirely inconvenient. She pressed it down. She returned her eyes to the letter. She read to the end. He said nothing. He sat down. He opened the document he was carrying. He did not read it. What he had seen, standing at the far door, was a woman in a plain, dark dress sitting beside an elderly housekeeper in a window that gave onto a bare spring garden, reading aloud from a letter that was not her own in a voice calibrated exactly to the old woman's comfort. Not theatrical, not performative, simply present. She had not known she was observed, and because she had not known, there was nothing in her manner to read as calculation. She was simply doing a kind thing, without anyone to credit her for it, in the patient way of someone to whom the act itself was sufficient reason. He had last seen that quality in his brother. He had been looking for it in the household, in the people around him, for 2 years. Nora returned her attention to Mrs. Cartwright's letter. Her hands were entirely steady. Everything else about her was not. He called her nothing at all, which was perhaps its own kind of notice. Not the Miss Beale of formal address. Not the impersonal girl that the household used. Simply a silence where her name would have gone. As if he were saving the act of naming her for a moment that had not yet arrived. That morning, before she had come to the library, she had passed through the morning room and heard Lady Wharton speaking to Miss Fairweather, who sat very straight in a chair the color of her gown and accepted the information with polished composure. "The clumsy creature has been retained in some reduced capacity," Lady Wharton said. "I cannot account for it, and I shall not attempt to. I have told Fenn my position is unchanged, and I trust the matter will resolve itself in time." Miss Prudence Fairweather had been the diamond of the previous season, a woman of 25 with fine features and a settled confidence that had been correctly oriented all her life. She had been seated at the Duke of Asterfield's right hand the night of the dinner party, a placement that Lady Wharton had arranged and that everyone at the table had understood. She said, in response to Lady Wharton's observation, "I am sure he has his reasons," and the composure of it was so perfectly calibrated that it could have meant anything at all. Nora passed through the morning room and said nothing, and went to the library and began to work. She had been in the library 11 days when the Duke came in one evening after the household had gone to their rooms and sat down in his usual chair and set a candle on the table between them and said nothing for a long time. The library was otherwise dark. The fire had burned down. The single candle cast the room in a narrow, warm light that did not reach the shelves. Nora set down the volume she had been cataloging and waited. "My brother," the Duke of Asterfield said, "died 2 years ago, in Portugal. He was 22 years old." He paused. He set a small oval miniature on the table beside the candle, a painted portrait of a young man with the same dark hair and a livelier face, a face that had not yet learned the cost of being careful. "He died because someone in this household sold his regiment's position. We never established who. I have believed for some time, I know. I have been waiting for proof." He picked up the miniature and held it for a moment and set it back down. "The soup," he said, "was not an accident. I do not mean your spilling of it. I mean its preparation." The room was very quiet. A log shifted in the grate. The candle between them did not move. "I smelled something wrong," Nora said. Her voice came out level, which surprised her. "I did not know what to do. I thought I might be mistaken." "You were not mistaken," he said. "The bowl went to the kitchen, and I had it examined the following morning by a man I trust. What you smelled was henbane, a sufficient quantity to have ensured I did not survive the night." He paused again. "I have not thanked you." "You kept me here," she said. "I kept you here because the person who arranged the preparation knows your face. Until I have resolved the matter, you are safer inside this house than outside of it." He was quiet a moment. "I kept you here for other reasons besides. I will not pretend otherwise." He said it without drama, the way he said most things, plain and level, and stripped of the decorative uncertainty that most people used as a courtesy. It was the most direct thing he had said to her, and it landed in the quiet room with exactly the weight of what it was. The candle between them was not tall. The light it threw was intimate and indiscriminate, catching the line of his jaw and the particular quality of tiredness that lived behind his eyes and that she had been cataloging alongside the books for 11 days without having named it. She understood it now. It was the specific exhaustion of a man who had been waiting a long time to trust again and had not yet found the circumstances that would allow it. His brother's death had sealed something in him, and whatever he had let out in the past 11 days had been let out carefully, in small and deniable portions, as if he were testing the tolerance of a structure he had reason not to trust. She thought of her father. She thought of the entail, and the year that had followed, and the slow unwinding of everything she had believed was permanent. She thought of the way grief arrived not as a single blow, but as a long rearrangement of what one had taken to be solid ground, and how a person could spend months not recognizing the new landscape, reaching for furniture that was no longer there. "I am sorry about your brother," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not immediately classify. Then he said, "Go to bed, Miss Beale. Fen will walk you upstairs." She rose. She gathered her things. At the door she stopped, though she had not intended to, and turned. "I am the daughter of Thomas Beale of Langford," she said. "I did not mention it when I was hired. I did not know whether it would matter." "I know who you are," he said. She went upstairs. She lay on her cot in the dark and thought about the miniature, which he had set on the table and then placed back in his coat pocket with the care of someone returning something very small and very important to the place it lived. She thought about the particular way he had looked at the portrait before he set it down. She had seen that look on her father's face in the last months before his death, when he held her mother's gloves and did not know he was being observed. If you are still here, if you have held all of this alongside her, then you know already what kind of man sees clearly and says nothing, and what it costs him to wait. Hold that knowledge. The rest of this will need it. Bernard Carrel had spent the better part of his 36 years understanding exactly where he stood in the room at any given moment. He stood, in relation to the Duke of Asterfield, at a precise and calculable remove. One life between himself and an inheritance that would resolve every debt he had accumulated and every obligation he had deferred. He was not a man of violent instincts. He was a man of arithmetic. The arithmetic had simply led him somewhere he now recognized, too late, as a room from which there was no comfortable exit. He had known, within 12 hours of the dinner, that the soup had not achieved its purpose. He had spent the following days watching the Duke of Asterfield's face for evidence of knowledge, and finding only the usual composed absence that made the man so difficult to read. He had watched the maid's face for the same evidence. He had arrived at a conclusion that felt, in its elegance, almost satisfying. The girl was a liability. Remove the liability, and the room became more manageable. He came to Lady Wharton on a Tuesday morning in the second week of May. He did not tell her about the soup. He told her, instead, a carefully selected portion of the truth: that the girl currently cataloging the library was not who she claimed to be, that she had obtained her position under false representations, and that he had strong reason to believe she had been helping herself to small valuables from the upper rooms. He had a list. The list was fabricated, but it was specific, and specificity was more convincing than volume. Lady Wharton listened to this with the concentrated attention she brought to information that confirmed what she had already believed to be true. She had never found a satisfactory explanation for the girl's retention. This one was satisfactory. She rang for Fenn. The household was assembled in the drawing room at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Not all of it. Not the upstairs maids or the kitchen staff, but sufficient of the indoor servants, and Miss Fairweather, and 2 of the guests who had not yet departed, and whom Lady Wharton had decided should witness the matter settled. Nora was sent for, and arrived to find the assembled company arranged with a spatial clarity she recognized immediately. Lady Wharton stood at the fireplace. Bernard Carrel stood at Lady Wharton's right. Miss Fairweather sat to one side with the expression of a woman who has been asked to attend something she would have preferred not to witness. She had not known this morning in the library, reading Cowper to herself in the good spring light, that this afternoon would carry what it carried. She had been happy in the unannounced and provisional way of someone who does not allow herself the word, but inhabits its neighborhood, and she had not known to guard against the afternoon. "You came to this household," Lady Wharton said, addressing Nora directly, "under false representations and with a concealed identity. That alone would be grounds for immediate dismissal. We are now further informed that items of value have gone missing from the upper rooms in the period of your assignment to this house. You are the deceitful maid who deceived this household twice over, and I will not permit your continued presence under this roof for another hour." Nora held herself very still. The room had that particular quality of collective attention that felt like physical weight. She was aware of Bernard Carrel watching her with the smooth patience of a man who believed the matter was already decided. His face showed nothing, and that nothingness was more specific than any expression. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that the room would hear. Lady Wharton drew breath to continue. The drawing-room door opened. Edmund Calder, Duke of Asterfield, was 34 years old, and had been, for 2 of those years, a man who trusted nothing that was not verified. He came into the room without haste and without announcement, still wearing his riding coat, and the specific quality of stillness he carried was so familiar to the household that the room reorganized itself around his entrance without appearing to move at all. The fire at the far end of the drawing-room caught the brass buttons of his coat as he passed. He did not look at the assembled servants. He did not look at Lady Wharton. He looked, from the moment he entered, at Nora. He did not go to Lady Wharton. He did not go to Bernard. He crossed the room in 7 strides and came to rest beside Nora, and he was so close that she could feel the cold still in his coat from the outside air, the particular cold of late May afternoons in the park, and she had time to register the warmth beneath it. The warmth of a living man standing at an arm's length from her in a room that had decided, again, what she was. "Miss Beale is not dismissed," he said. "She is my guest." The drawing-room was quiet. Lady Wharton said, "Edmund?" He turned then toward Bernard, and his face was absolutely composed, which made what he said next something almost more terrible than anger would have been. "My cousin will leave this house tonight," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded paper, which he set on the table between them, with the precision of someone placing evidence rather than delivering an accusation. This was obtained from the apothecary in Cheapside on the 14th of March. It is in your handwriting. I have had 2 men verify it. Bernard did not reach for the paper. The particular quality of silence that followed was the kind that settles when a room of people adjusts, simultaneously, to the discovery that the walls are arranged differently than they had believed. Lady Wharton looked at Bernard. Something shifted in her face, not yet understanding the full dimension of what had been arranged, but catching, at the corners of it, the shape of a thing far worse than a bad marriage. She looked at the paper. She looked at her nephew. She looked, briefly, at Nora, with an expression that could not be called recognition, but was adjacent to it. "Go," Edmund said to Bernard. He did not say it loudly. He did not need to. Bernard Carrel went. Miss Prudence Fairweather rose from her chair with a composure that was genuine and that cost her something real, and she nodded briefly to Nora with the respect of one woman acknowledging another who has occupied an untenable position with more grace than the room deserved, and she left. Lady Wharton sat down heavily in the chair nearest the fire and said nothing at all for a long moment. Then she said, to no one specifically, "I did not know." "No," Edmund said. "You did not." That was all he said on the subject. The drawing room emptied. Nora remained standing where she was, because she was not certain she had been given permission to do otherwise. The Duke of Asterfield stood with his back to the fireplace and looked at her with an attention that was different. Now from the attention she had catalogued across 11 days in the library, less careful, less contained, less organized around the discipline of a man who had decided not to let himself feel anything that might be used against him. He said, "Nora." It was the first time he had used her given name. He used it as if he had been deciding when to use it for some weeks, and had arrived now at the moment that was the right one. She felt the sound of it in her chest before she had formed any response to it. "You knew about the entail," she said. "Not a question." "Fenn looked into your references the morning after the dinner," he said. "He is thorough. And you kept me here anyway. You saved my life," he said. "And then I kept you here because you were in danger. And then I kept you here because—" He paused. The pause was the kind that comes before something honest that a careful man has not said aloud before. "Because I did not want you to go." The candle on the table between them was the same candle he had brought to the library, burned down nearly to the holder. It gave less light now than it had given then. The room was warm and very quiet, and Nora was aware of the space between them with the particular precision of someone who had spent weeks cataloging exactly where he was at any given moment without allowing herself to know why. "You might have told me," she said, "about the poison, about your brother." "I might have," he said. "I did not trust myself to say it without saying everything else at the same time." She understood then what everything else was. She had perhaps understood it for some days, and had simply not permitted the understanding to arrive in any usable form. The way he had watched her read to Mrs. Cartwright, and had not left. The way he had brought the candle. The way he sat in the library in the mornings with documents he did not read, in the specific company of her silence. She said, "Your Grace." He said, "Edmund." There was a long moment in which neither of them moved, in which the candle guttered once and steadied, in which the fire made its small sounds and the spring evening pressed quietly against the drawing-room windows. He was close enough that she could smell the outdoors still on his coat, and the particular warm scent of the room, the beeswax and the old wood and the candle. And she thought of her father's library at Langford with a pang that was not quite grief because it was threaded with something else entirely, something that had no name in the taxonomy of losses she had been cataloging since the entail. She took one step. He did not move, but the quality of his stillness changed. She was close enough now to see the line of tension in his jaw, the deliberate steadiness of his breath, the effort a man makes when he has decided to wait. She thought that if she touched his hand, she could not unmake it. She thought that he had already said everything else and was waiting for her to find it too. She reached out and set her fingers against the back of his hand, which was cold still from the ride, and felt his breath change, and did not look away. His hand was large, and the bones of it were familiar to her in a way she had no right to. And when he turned it and closed his fingers over hers, the warmth of it moved up her arm and into the center of her chest and stayed there. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at their joined hands. Then he said, "I have not asked you a question." "No," she said. "I am going to ask you one." "I know," she said. The quiet that followed was the kind of quiet that has already decided its answer, the two of them standing in the room where the hierarchy had twice declared its verdict against her, the candle very low between them, the spring evening holding itself entirely still outside the windows. He asked. She answered. They were engaged before the last of the candle burned away, the terms arrived at in the plain declarative language of two people who had spent enough time in each other's company to have learned how to say what they meant. He would speak to his solicitor in the morning. She would write to her sister in Bath. There was nothing extravagant about any of it, and the absence of extravagance was the best thing about it. The following morning, Lady Wharton presented herself at the library door with the expression of a woman who has spent the night revising her understanding of events and has arrived at something approaching clarity. She said to Nora, "I did not know what Bernard had done. I want you to understand that." "I understand it," Nora said. "I was not kind to you," Lady Wharton said. "I was not." She paused, choosing between several things she might have added, and chose the shortest. "I hope you will be happy here." She was not a woman who found apology natural, and the effort of it was visible in the set of her shoulders, and Nora respected the effort enough to meet it honestly. "Thank you," she said. Lady Wharton left. Nora returned to the shelves. She stood at the shelf for a moment with a volume in her hands and did not immediately open it. The room was quiet. Outside the library windows, the garden was doing what spring gardens did in the second week of May, the roses putting out their first tentative leaves, the lawn still carrying the particular flat green of a season not yet settled into itself. She had watched that garden every morning for 11 days, from the vantage of someone who did not yet know whether she would still be here by the following week. She was still here. She was, according to the conversation she had held last night in the drawing room with an empty turene's worth of silence behind her, going to remain. She placed the volume on the shelf. She chose the correct location. She moved to the next. Edmund came to the library that afternoon, as he had come every afternoon, and sat in his chair, and did not bring a document. The spring light came through the rear windows and lay in oblongs on the floor between them, and the old housekeeper, Mrs. Cartwright, dozed in the window seat with her hands folded and her face tipped toward the warmth. Nora worked. Edmund watched her work. They were both entirely aware of being watched and of watching, and neither of them made any attempt to disguise it, which was its own kind of declaration. "I have something of yours," Edmund said. He set it on the table between them. The cover was worn at the corners, the boards gone soft from years of handling, the title faded along the spine to near illegibility, but present still. Her father's copy of Cowper's poems, which had fallen from her apron pocket in the corridor on the night of the dinner, and which she had believed she had lost in the chaos of the evening and the weeks that followed. She picked it up and held it, and did not say anything for a moment. Because there is a particular quality of being known that arrives not in grand declarations, but in the small evidence that someone has noticed what you carry, and has thought it worth preserving. He had picked it up from the floor of that corridor on the night the soup spilled, the night he watched his cousin's face and understood what had been arranged, and he had kept it for 3 weeks without mentioning it, and now he set it on the table between them as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "You kept it," she said. "I found it," he said. "That same night, after the household had gone in." She held the book in both hands. The spine was warm from where the sun had reached it through the library windows. She thought of her father, and the kitchen garden, and the bees, and then she thought of the library around her, and the spring light, and the man sitting 4 feet away who had been paying attention. Quietly and without announcement, for longer than she had known. She opened the book to the first page. Her father's handwriting, inside the front cover, still clear and strong as it had always been. For the one who reads at the window. She did not need to explain to Edmund what it meant. He was already reading it over her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against her arm, and he did not need to explain to her what that meant either. Outside the library windows, the spring season was in its 2nd week. The world had its opinions about what she was and where she had come from, and what a girl from a ruined estate could reasonably expect from a life that had already delivered its verdict once. The world's opinion had always been available. It was no longer the opinion she most valued. She set the book on the table beside the unlit candle. She would read him something later, when the afternoon darkened into evening, as she had read to Mrs. Cartwright, not as service, not as performance, but because some things deserved to be spoken aloud in the presence of someone who would hear them. The library was very quiet, and the light was good, and she was, at last, exactly where she was. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If Nora's courage moved you, leave a word in the comments. And if you have not yet subscribed, this is the moment.